Alright, so Unit 1, basically jumping right into the biology. So you have to know what biology starts with. It's biology. It's actually broken into pieces where if you look at biology, it's the study of life. So if you look at any other science, it's the study of something. In this case, it's living things. So the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out what is life. And it sounds very simple, but there are a couple tricky ones. Like, for example, if I give you a pencil, I say, is that a living thing? Even though it may have been a tree at one time and alive, you know it's now dead, but is it still classified as living, or is it a non-living thing? So what they did is they made a checklist of things. They actually made a scientific checklist where they can check every one off, and if it hits all of the check marks, it is classified as a living thing. Again, it sounds simple, but there are a couple that are actually kind of confusing, like what about bacteria? What about viruses? What about specific types of atoms that act almost like they have a brain? So we will get into all that. So there's a little trick. You can actually use the thing to memorize all the characteristics of life. Anytime you're confused and you want to go through your list, you can use egg char. That doesn't really mean anything. It's kind of nonsense. However, EGGCHARR, it's something you can use to memorize it. That way, if you forget all of them, you don't have to memorize them all like a list. You just memorize this goofy little phrase or little kind of combination of letters, and there you go. So, characteristics of life. We'll jump right into the first one. E stands for evolve. If the organism or the thing in question can evolve, basically it can take its environment, determine what traits or what things are more beneficial, and then change them in the next generation. That's evolving. Everything does evolution. All living things evolve. If they didn't, eventually something would happen where they weren't able to be really successful and they would die out. If you can't evolve, you'll eventually kind of get wiped out. First G stands for genetic code. So genetic code is going to deal with DNA. When you have DNA and RNA and you talk about passing on traits, or like two things able to take their existing traits or their existing stuff and pass it on, that's genetic code. There you go. It hits that check mark. Next G number 2 is grow and develop. Grow and develop means you are actually growing in size, like actually maybe developing extra parts as you get older, or as you develop, or as you gain more size, you're going to change. There are things that can grow and develop but aren't technically living. Like, again, you have to hit all of them. So like, you can't look at any one specific and try to apply it to all the stuff. It has to hit all of them. I mean, you could look at a pile of dirt in your backyard that you throw a cup on every day. It's technically growing. It's not really a living thing. C stands for cells. So if you are made up of cells, that automatically checks this off. We have taken all of life on Earth, and we've studied biology on Earth, and we have figured that the basic component of life is cells. You can get smaller than cells. You can go down into the atoms and all that, but for biologists, the smallest we really get as far as determining life, this is the basic unit of life, is cells. Once you get into chemistry, you can go down to atoms and neutrons and protons and electrons. But for now, we're going to assume this is our basic building block. Like if you are building a giant Lego castle, this is just the first block. And then we can build all that. H, homeostasis. Homeostasis is a fancy word for balance or equilibrium. If you have a fever and then it goes up to 105, 106, and it keeps going up and up and up, eventually you're going to die if you cannot bring it back down. Same thing if it gets really low. If you are out in the cold and it's like negative 10 degrees and your body temperature drops to 90, then you die from hypothermia. Homeostasis means the body, or whatever it is on the organism, can establish a balance, kind of like a default position, and it'll bring it back to the default position, either if it gets too high or gets too low. A, acquire and use energy. So this one is probably the easiest to recognize. If it cannot find a way to get energy, then obviously it can't do any processes that require energy. So, for example, a car might be able to use energy. Yes, it can take gasoline and combust it in the engine, and it can use the energy. However, it doesn't have any way to acquire it itself. It kind of just gets refilled. So, we can't really classify cars as a living thing, even though it does use up some kind of energy or some kind of fuel. First R, Respond to the environment. This means you are going to be able to look at your environment or sense your environment or feel your environment and respond to it. This can be something as simple as touch. This can be something as simple as just a chemical change in your environment and then you do something different. Last R is reproduce. Don't get reproduce and replicate confused. Sometimes they get a little wishy-washy. Reproducing is like asexual or sexual reproduction. Replicating, like if I take a ball of Play-Doh and I put it on the counter, and then I make a second ball of Play-Doh and put it on the counter, the Play-Doh didn't have sex. Like it didn't reproduce. That wasn't asexual or sexual reproduction. I just made another one. I just replicated it. It's like a factory. I can replicate 1,000 of something. That's not reproduction. And that basically sums up the characteristics of life. If they do not check off every single one of these, they are not living. They can check off 7 of them. They're not living. If they don't hit all of them, it's all or nothing. Once you've decided that it's a living thing, and you can study it with biology, you have to figure out what makes it up. So, we're going to go straight into molecules of life. These are called a bunch of different things. You may have heard biomolecules, macromolecules, macronutrients. There's all kinds of stuff that people will call this, but really it's the living molecules. We've taken all the stuff that's living, and we study it, and we find out that they all have these things in common. First one, you will know this one immediately. This is a carbohydrate. Carbs, just like bread, pasta, sugars. These are all carbs. Technically, vegetables are a carb. Like, you may not think of carbs, you may think of white rice, you may think of pasta, but broccoli is a carb. It's just a very, very low carb. So the CHO, that means that it has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. If you have many pieces clicked together, for example, going back to the Lego example, if you have one Lego block, one red Lego, separately, they're just one, but when I click them together, they become what's called a polymer, which is many. Polymer of a carb is polysaccharide. Monomer, which is just one Lego block, would be a monosaccharide. Saccharide is just a sugar, so I either have one sugar or many sugars. Glucose, one sugar. Starch, glycogen, many sugars. Next one is the lipid. Again, you'll know this one. This is just fat. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Polymer, which is the big string of it. Imagine you have a string of Mardi Gras beads. If you have the entire string, that's the polymer. One little bead is the monomer. So the polymer of a lipid, just a lipid or a fat. That's basically all we call it. The monomer, one little bead, is a fatty acid and a glycerol tail. Protein. Again, you know a lot about protein, so hopefully this will just be a refresher. Protein is going to have CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but then it's also going to have nitrogen. This is what makes it different from carbs and lipids and makes it a little bit more difficult to synthesize, like to actually create on the chemistry level, because you need an extra element. The polymer, just protein. The monomer is an amino acid. So amino acids, you probably have heard that because you can walk down an aisle in a grocery store or GNC and there's branch chain amino acids, amino acid supplements, amino acid this, amino acid that in protein. So it is basically it's the building block of protein. It's the Lego block. So I'm trying to build a big muscle and I need 100 Legos to build that muscle. The amino acids are going to fill in those gaps. You can make some of them and you have to eat some of them. That's why a lot of people say to eat stuff right after you work out or after you train or something. Because if you're trying to build protein, you're trying to build muscle, then you can't build it if you don't have the materials. You're just going to be sitting there trying to rebuild a protein polymer and you don't have enough amino acids, so you can't make the string. Last one, and probably the least familiar, is nucleic acid. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then phosphorus. The polymer, you'll recognize these rather than the word nucleic acid. The polymer is DNA and RNA. The monomer, which is again one Lego block, is called a nucleotide. When I'm looking at my genetic code, it looks the same from just like a large perspective. It's our double helix, our little spiral. It looks the same as other humans. However, each little component of it is going to have a different order of nucleotides. A nucleotide is going to have a phosphate, a sugar, and what's called a nitrogen base. The nitrogen base is what's different. Everybody has the phosphate and the sugar. It's like the side of the ladder. The rung of the ladder that you would actually step on is the nitrogen base. I can have my brother, who looks very, very similar to me, has the same parents, and if I look at his order of bases, maybe it's TAAC. Mine could be TAAG. That's going to give me something different. The order, kind of like computer code, how does all the ones and zeros? The code is going to actually make what my traits are. My body's going to read that code and say, all right, this means blonde hair, this means brown hair, this means blue eyes, this means 6'5", this means 5'5". It's going to read these as traits. That way it knows what to build. From the second you're born, or really the second you're even created, from the sperm and egg fusion to the zygote, the DNA is set. Your DNA is going to be the same your entire life. So you can change your body, you can dye your hair, you can get really big, you can get really skinny. It's not changing your DNA. You're just manipulating cells and manipulating other stuff, but you always have the same DNA. So you can have very skinny parents and you're skinny your whole life, and then you just decide to get really fat and gain 100 pounds and then have a kid. Your kid's not going to necessarily come out enormous because your genes may be for a skinny person. You just decided to let yourself go and eat too much fast food. That is the molecules of life. That is everything that makes up living organisms. Carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Remember, all of these are strings of stuff. We can break them into the single bead of the Mardi Gras beads, but they are all strings, all polymers. 3 out of the 4 of these are going to contain energy. We'll get into energy later, so just know, you eat carbs, you eat lipids, you eat proteins. Nucleic acids, I can eat a big pile of DNA, nothing happens. It doesn't have any caloric value, but we'll get into energy more later. Just know that if something is in your body, it's probably made up of a carb, lipid, protein, or nucleic acid, because you are living.